Okay, before I begin this, I would like to clarify that this list was not I was expecting. While he is right about the history, he doesn't focus on his opinion very well. Basically, it's going to be mostly opinionated. Facts will come when it's needed. Let's begin.
In the 80s, the home video game industry in North America died due to a glut of terrible software produced by unauthorized publishers/developers, flooding the market and effectively turning many customers and retailers off of gaming. Anyone could make a game, no questions asked, and sell it to anyone. How could Nintendo succeed in a dead industry, let alone revitalize it and restore people's trust in it? Well, Nintendo's brilliant idea was this.
Don't let that little sticker fool you, we owe everything to it. Nintendo established a third-party licensing program that restricted how many games a publisher could release in a year. This meant that developers had to put their best foot forward, or not at all. It went as far as NES cartridges having to be made through Nintendo itself. Sure, some tried to circumvent it, but that quickly proved too difficult. Nintendo made it far more profitable to make games with long-term goals rather than to make a quick buck. Though that didn't stop a lot of bad games from slipping through the cracks.
Yeah, every generation has that shovelware target. If you happen to be the most popular gaming platform, everyone's gonna try and make a quick buck off your popularity and highly protect you if you happen to be a pre-licensed property. And boy, howdy, did we get a smorgasbord of crap games for the NES. Yeah, game development was still new, but it seems so many people were able to coast on the popularity of the NES and other licensed properties. And let's count our blessings. We never had anything like Custer's Revenge, so Nintendo's strategy worked, just not as well as everyone hoped.
Unfortunately, the sticker eventually came into controversy. The term seal of quality implies that the game is good, and Nintendo came under some heat from salty nerds claiming false advertisement. This is why you rented before you bought in the 90s, kids. Anyway, Nintendo quietly changed the seal to read Official Nintendo Licensed Product. So did that fix things? Nope.
Fast forward a few years and oh man, there is a serious lack of quality control for the Wii. You know that limitation of how many games you can publish in a year on Nintendo consoles? Well, that doesn't really do much when you only need one game to make bank.
Have you ever heard of Sturgeon's Law? It states that anything and everything can be considered art. But 90% of that art is utter crap. As much as I love the Wii, it definitely started pushing the boundaries of that adage.
Seriously, finding a good third-party Wii game amongst the garbage was a chore. And this glut of kiddie shovelware really prevented a lot of publishers from taking the console as seriously as Nintendo themselves did. I still remember the GT forum days where Wii is just a fad.
And don't even get us started on the handhelds. I can't tell you how many bad games based on movies or TV shows were released for the Game Boy Advance and DS. The worst part is that it's still going on today. Seriously, the Nintendo eShop is filled with terrible ports of mobile games. But as much as we complain about this, to Nintendo's credit, they were able to re-establish some sort of standard. And again, this policy literally saved the industry. But there are days when we wish they were just a wee bit stricter.
If you put too much restriction on someone, you have become a communist. If Nintendo putted too much restrictions on a third-party company, then a game can't compete on another game on the same console. It's like saying Nintendo shouldn't let Sega software strive. And I like the Sonic games the most. Even the games that focus on something new and not classic ones.
Now we all know that Nintendo is all about innovation. And sometimes we get some really amazing stuff. And other times, we get some really weird shit. Sometimes both.
Now, there are so many embarrassing peripherals Nintendo has put out over the years that we could easily make a list dedicated to them alone. In fact...
Wait a second, where are you going with this?
Nintendo peripherals in 10 words or less. Ignore that.
Only one game used this!
Hyped, then vanished. Good, could easily abuse microtransactions.
Only one game used this!
Fire, fire, fire!
Overhyped Nintendo Zapper made immortal by Smash Brothers.
Fire, fire, fire!
Cute but unnecessary gimmick made immortal by Smash Brothers.
It's so bad. Well, at least the marketing's honest.
It's Digimon Tamers, except you never have a full Digimon.
You just spent $90 on a weight scale. Congrats.
And you thought the Genesis attachments were bad.
Pay us money for plastic!
Pay us money for cardboard!
So glad Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles is getting a remake.
Used by a lot of games. No one used it.
Only one game used this.
Selfie generation a decade before it happened, with bad filters.
You only own this because you bought Link's crossbow training.
At least it made Pokemon fans happy for a bit.
You want to play DK64 and Majora's Mask?
Useful at first, died off later.
Incredibly niche. Though, personally, I love this damn thing.
You would.
So being creative with the way you play is number 9? I guess that means other consoles shouldn't be following in Nintendo's footsteps. Despite the fact VR games do something different with the gaming genre and not everyone wants to play with just button inputs. The Wii and Wii U are guilty of a lot of ways to play. And the Wii had the best time in its lifespan. However, I think the other accessories outside of those two previous consoles are a good example of bad accessories if that was the norm.
Nintendo is a company that has had very strained relationships with third parties ever since the beginning. Even though the seal of quality policy helped revitalize the gaming industry, many third-party developers weren't happy with it. For some of them, only being able to release 5 games a year, as well as being forced to develop games exclusively for Nintendo, felt very limiting, both for their profit margins and, in some cases, their creativity. But Nintendo controlled over 90% of the market, so they really didn't have a choice.
But once Sega came along, oh lord, it got absolutely cutthroat. Due to Sega's aggressive marketing, third parties could now develop what they wanted without having Daddy Nintendo looming over them. Sure, the number of games they could develop were limited, but they weren't forced under any exclusivity contracts. It didn't help that Nintendo seemed to enjoy actively antagonizing other companies, Sony, and even got investigated for antitrust violations. But possibly the saddest example of this comes from Square.
See, Square was with Nintendo from the beginning, with Final Fantasy being made for the NES. Since then, they made a lot of great games for the Super Nintendo, such as Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Super Mario RPG. They obviously had a close relationship with Nintendo, but then they had the idea for Final Fantasy VII. They realized that they literally could not make the game they wanted on a Nintendo console. Even if the fabled N64 DD was a success, Final Fantasy VII would have spanned 30 discs. Think of that the next time you whine about having to change discs. So they told Nintendo that they were going to develop Final Fantasy VII for Sony, and Nintendo's response was a very politically correct,
"Now get out of here and never come back!"
Wow! Never thought Nintendo of all people would act like the jealous ex-girlfriend.
That just adds 15 layers of complexity to Cloud being in Smash.
I still called that years ago!
And if you think it ends there, well, it got worse. Because the N64 went with cartridges instead of the cheaper and roomier discs, as well as the Sony PlayStation being the new kid on the block ready and willing to have new games developed for it without super strict guidelines, third parties gleefully snubbed Nintendo, and the effects of this decision continued all throughout the GameCube's life cycle. Sure, they had some third-party support during all this, including from Sega weirdly enough, but given the competition from the newly developed Xbox and how much the PlayStation 2 was dominating the market, sometimes it felt like Capcom supported Nintendo out of pity.
Then the Wii came along. At the start, nearly every third party took it as a joke, only pushing out games with the faintest fart of an effort. Even after the Wii's popularity exploded, that still didn't stop third parties from only using Nintendo to make a quick buck, and only seemed to take the Xbox 360, PC, and PlayStation 3 seriously. Things didn't improve at all with the Wii U, as the confusing interface and poor marketing caused initially strong third-party support to slowly fizzle out. Hi, Ubisoft.
Nowadays, things seem to have gotten a lot better. The Nintendo Switch has been nicknamed the portable port machine, as many companies can't seem to resist porting over their best games to the console. Hello, Undertale. Weirdly, Bethesda of all companies seems to be very intent on supporting the Switch. Seriously, we got Doom 2016 on a Nintendo console, the family-friendly company. And on that note, can we be reminded that Bayonetta 2 would not exist if it weren't for Nintendo bringing her aboard the Wii U all those years ago? And given that Final Fantasy VII is being released on the Switch, I guess we can call that bygone bygone. That's how that word works, right?
Nintendo's relationship with third parties has been unbelievably rocky since day one. From smothering them with overly strict guidelines until they leave, then being unable to be taken seriously as a platform, to finally not being able to get enough of Nintendo, this whole situation might as well be a weird roundabout allegory about a controlling father who alienated his kids, then embarrassed himself in trying to get them back, but eventually ending on a happy note.
You know, I kinda wanna see that now.
This is Very confusing. Nintendo needs to make sure that there's a balance of their strict nature. I'm pretty sure that if you aren't strict enough, you will become a doormat. A company is like an enormous clock. If you don't focus on asserting yourself more, you're a broken one. I'm skipping number 7 since when one of the Nintendo members agrees with you, you are going to lose your luck. Second verse same as the first for number 6.
An interesting fact about Sony and Microsoft is that both have been observed muttering jealous remarks about the staying power of Nintendo's franchises. All things considered, they have a point. Most of Nintendo's biggest franchises like Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon have been around for literal decades and are still going strong today. Keyword most.
So, what happens when you ask Nintendo to bring back some of their more neglected franchises?
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3! How about this instead?
I know that skit is pure hyperbole, but does Nintendo hate their niche franchises or something? Because if so, I have a few questions for Sakurai.
Yeah, it's almost like Nintendo wants us to forget about some of their old franchises to a seemingly hostile extent. You want a new Rhythm Heaven? How about Golden Sun? Advance Wars? Chibi Robo? Custom Robo? Well, guess what? It ain't happening, despite a vast amount of gamers hammering at Nintendo to get on that cash cow.
Seriously, Nintendo, you have a base of rabid fans that are begging to give you their money. Why don't you want our money?
Shut up and take my money.
I'm pretty sure this meme conjured itself into existence for you. Why don't you take the hint?
It's only a game. Why you have to be mad?
And when Nintendo does release a game in these franchises, they often do so in a way that it feels like it belongs on the malicious compliance subreddit. Paper Mario Color Splash was a commercial failure, Metroid Federation Force was met with groans and facepalms, and how many Star Fox remakes do we really need? Seriously, all you have to do is use the same gameplay formula from 64, give it a few new improvements and features, and slap it onto a new narrative. That is practically what you do with all of your other franchises, and it works.
And the reason we give Nintendo crap for this is that they themselves have proven that reviving a dying franchise can lead to some serious success. Donkey Kong Country Returns brought the Big 8 back into the spotlight. And then there's Fire Emblem Awakening, which literally rekindled the Fire Emblem franchise into a global phenomenon. And don't even get me started on the mimetic zeitgeist known as Kid Icarus Uprising. I'm willing to bet that if they announce a new game in the Mother or F-Zero franchise, the fanbase will have no shortage of minds blown.
Thankfully, with Super Smash Bros. Ultimate celebrating the history of gaming, and the Nintendo Switch proving to be a revitalizing platform for some long-forgotten games, perhaps this issue will be addressed soon enough. Here's hoping Metroid Prime 4 is good.
So you're asking more quantity over quality. That's basically the problem. Sega has made the same mistake twice. To quote Shigeru Miyamoto, a delayed product is a good product, but a rushed product is bad forever. I am aware of updates, but the only problem is your first impression will probably be sour. I know you put some games that are old on there, but given that these games would have been better with updating shows that you kind of don't know limitations. I'm skipping number 4 because a lot of E3 are the biggest failure.
Oi, guess what, Scorpio B? Did you hear about these computer mobs? They can operate in color, and they can branch out to folks all around the world conveniently and without issue.
Well, razz my berries, that's some dandy technology. Why doesn't Nintendo get on the horn with that?
Haven't the foggiest!
Even though time waits for no one, Nintendo's got a tendency to fall behind when it comes to online services. Right off the bat, online netcoding with Nintendo is a nightmare! The only games with decent online gameplay are Mario Kart and Pokemon. Sorta!
Yeah, I actually hate the fact that you have to buy a separate piece of hardware just to play Smash Ultimate properly online. And even then, the sheer amount of frame delays makes Marvel vs. Capcom 3's online look good.
And then there's Splatoon. Not only is there no TeamSpeak making communicating with your squad impossible, but it also had a punishment system set up for players who left matches early. Not a bad idea in theory, but the online netcode was so bad that disconnections were common, and anyone who had an accidental disconnect got hit with the ban button almost instantly.
And what's that? You want to play with your friends? No problem. All you need to do is enter your inconveniently long friend code and send them to your buddies elsewhere. I mean, it's not like other platforms like Steam have a friend request button that saves you all that trouble. Oh, wait!
And I want to briefly touch upon the DLC real quick because Nintendo has an equal amount of awesome and terrible DLC. Getting to play them is a different matter. We will say this, however, they have grown a lot in terms of online shopping, starting from the Wii Shop with WiiWare. WiiWare. Yeah, that. You could download games straight to your console without having to step a foot out the door. And would only continue to grow until we reached our most recent innovation, the Switch Online Shop and the Nintendo eShop.
However, this only raises new problems. The online shops still have a few design flaws that make them a bit more inconvenient than they need to be, particularly the verification systems. Plus, I've noticed that Nintendo has been going a bit ham with the online subscriptions. Now, I'm not necessarily against paying an annual fee for online features, it is a service after all, but now Pokemon Home requires a subscription, and it's not quite overboard yet. The pricing for these services is okay, but it's getting a little worrisome.
And therein lies the problem. They'll force you to be online and then not put their best foot forward to make sure you can enjoy the experience. There are so many great online communities just waiting to get tapped into, and Nintendo has no idea how to work with them. When did console gaming get so exhausting?
Online is barely a concern. Here's an idea. Get a better Wi-Fi router. If you don't want to use an Ethernet adapter, that's fine. But don't blame Nintendo for terrible Wi-Fi. The recessive gameplay for the Wii was terrible, I'll give you that. But that's it.
If you've been creating content for YouTube for, I don't know, like 10, 5, 2 years, then you're probably familiar with that.
Uploading any kind of content involving an existing IP is pretty much impossible to do without upsetting some copyright holder every now and then. And for a while, Nintendo was one of the biggest crybabies. They were absolutely ravenous when it came to takedowns back in the day. And even though they relaxed a little in recent times, people still live in fear of Nintendo's laser-guided takedowns. Though, to be fair, some people had it coming. But that doesn't excuse taking a dump on the fans who do these things out of love for the company.
Because it's not like people making videos about your games can easily be a form of free promotion or anything. Now, Nintendo has definitely turned down the heat these days, but the Nintendo Creators Program requires you to share a portion of your ad revenue with them, so it's not 100% perfect. Of course, YouTubers get off easy compared to the fan games.
Just about every Nintendo fan game developer lives in constant anxiety that one day they'll be the next one to receive the dreaded cease and desist. We've seen a ridiculous number of incredibly interesting looking games be yanked off the internet by them, usually before the game can even come out.
Ocarina of Time 2D, please face wall. Pokémon Fusion Generation, please face wall. Pokémon Essentials, please face wall. Super Mario 64 HD, please face wall. Metroid 2 Remake number I lost count, please face wall. Shadows of Lilith, please face wall. Star Fox Animated Series. Oh fuck no, we ain't having no furry degenerates, I'll do it myself.
The worst part about all of this is that other game publishers have adapted to the times when it comes to fan creations. Namco commissioned a fan artist to promote Tales of Berseria, Capcom promoted a Mega Man fan game, and Sega brought on fan developers to create Sonic Mania, which quickly became one of Sonic's most beloved games.
Meanwhile, Nintendo actively refuses to adapt to the times. It's a real shame because when they do try a modern trend, they do create some good things. All the great and mostly free DLC and updates for Hyrule Warriors, heck, Splatoon is technically Nintendo's online shooter. They can succeed, so it makes it a little more annoying when they blunder.
On the flip side though, Cadence of Hyrule is a small step in the right direction regarding fan support, not to mention Sans and Cuphead appearing in Smash Bros. Hopefully that's a sign of better things to come, but I'm not holding my breath.
I only half agree with this statement. If Nintendo don't protect their copyrighted work, they risk things going out of control. It's the fan gamer developers' fault for not asking for permission for the content.
Most of the fails we've covered on this list so far have consisted of relatively recent blunders from Nintendo, and some of them have thankfully led to Nintendo learning from their mistakes. However, in order to find their greatest folly, we must journey far into the past, nearly 30 years ago.
Is this an obvious number one? Nintendo wanted to create an add-on for the Super Nintendo that would allow it to play games from the far more powerful CDs. For reference, an SNES cartridge could hold about 4 megabytes. A CD could hold around 700. So to make this a reality, Nintendo struck a deal with Sony and would call it the Nintendo PlayStation.
I would pay money to see that alternate timeline.
Fast forward to 1991 at the Consumer Electronics Show, where Sony had already told the world that they were working with Nintendo. At their conference, Nintendo was expected to reveal the result of their collaboration with Sony to the gaming public. Instead, they revealed that they were canceling their deal with Sony and that the add-on was being developed by Philips.
As for why this happened, it's a bit complex. To try and summarize while still getting all the nuances, Nintendo didn't like that Sony had the ability to make and sell games without buying them from the former. There are also some indications within the contract that Sony intended to eventually assimilate Nintendo, and Sony would also gain the rights to properties such as Mario and Zelda. So rather than try and renegotiate the nature of the deal with Sony, Nintendo decided to ruthlessly crush them. They straight up went behind their backs, struck a deal with Philips instead, and basically took all the ideas and assets for the shiny new console and left Sony out to dry, all the while publicly humiliating them in front of the entire world.
Wow! Move, Nintendo!
Sony now had nothing but an unfinished console. But instead of wallowing in their own self-pity, Sony tightened up their bootstraps and got to work. They took the concepts and the ideas that they got from working with Nintendo and eventually developed their own CD-based console. This would eventually become the Sony PlayStation.
And what did Nintendo have to show for stabbing Sony in the back?
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
I hope she made lots of spaghetti.
I wonder what's for dinner.
When you pinch Wendy's pennies, they pinch back.
Or else you will die.
All toasters toast toast.
After you've scrubbed all the floors in Hyrule, then we can talk about mercy.
Ouch.
Because of Nintendo's short-sightedness, one of the most powerful and lucrative names in the game industry was born, and bringing with it some of the most popular franchises. And because of Sony's less strict policies, beefier hardware, older demographic, and space-friendly CD formats seeming more appealing to third parties, the PlayStation absolutely crushed the N64. Meanwhile, the Philips CDI would go down in history as one of the worst consoles ever created.
Well, that didn't work.
Now don't get us wrong, the PlayStation itself is amazing. After all, it's home to some of our favorite games of all time. The fail here is that Nintendo ended up creating its greatest rival after Sega had shot themselves in the foot multiple times. Although, when you really think about it, this astronomical blunder might have ended up benefiting the gaming industry in the long run.
Nintendo's cutthroat ruthlessness in their early life inadvertently created competition for themselves, causing both these companies to make greater strides to win fans. Not only did Sony thrive from this, but it also gave Microsoft the incentive to enter the industry too. Nintendo was no longer the dominant player in the game, and at the time, that was a good thing.
It truly says a lot when, in the end, Nintendo's greatest failure ended up being one of the most wonderful things to ever happen to the gaming industry. This countdown ended on a good note.
Well, the last bit you brought up was satisfying. But the only problem is that the reason why Nintendo refused this is because of trust issues. Nintendo didn't want to use CDs because they thought it could be hacked. Not to mention disc games would go to Sony and cartridges would go to Nintendo. Cartridges have less storage than CDs, so that meant Sony would have gotten more money on CDs. The funny thing is you brought it up in your other parts of the list. Final thoughts: this wasn't the worst list I've seen from you, but the fact you kept shooting yourself in the foot shows you can't keep consistency on your list. And when a Nintendo fanboy is telling you this, you have a huge problem. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and get notified for more of my work.